She received the newspaperman in a vivid red housecoat, rings crowding her fingers, a woman of obvious means, settling into her chair with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once in her life been asked to prove who she was. It was November of 1884, and the reporter from the Aberdeen Evening News had come to interview a remarkable literary lady who had arrived on the Isle of Skye to study, so she said, the suffering of the Crofters at first hand. She spoke with the polish of a woman raised among title and privilege. She wore the stones of a woman who had never known want. Every detail of the room she received him in, the housecoat, the rings, the calm, was a performance, and it was a performance so complete that not one person in that room that day thought to ask what lay underneath it. Underneath it was a woman who had been raised in a poor house, who could barely read or write, and who was at that very moment constructing the largest and cruelest confidence game of her career on the backs of 1,000 of the poorest families in the Scottish Highlands. Tonight we revisit one case with no body and no grave, and yet it belongs beside any murder this channel has ever told, because what was taken here was not a single life but the last hope of an entire community, offered a way out of ruin and sold instead a lie so large it would take years to fully understand what had actually been stolen. One woman, at least 40 invented identities across a criminal career spanning 3 continents. One scheme against the Crofters of Skye so audacious that its true scale still is not fully known. The case of Annie Gordon Baillie begins not on Skye at all, but in the fishing port of Peterhead, in Aberdeenshire, in the poverty she would spend the whole of her adult life running from. She was born in February of 1848, the illegitimate daughter of a washerwoman, her father unknown or unnamed in any surviving record. Peterhead in the middle of the 19th century was a hard, salt-scoured town built entirely around the herring trade, its streets full of gutting sheds and drying yards, its women worn old by the work before they had properly finished being young. A washerwoman's daughter born outside marriage started life with almost nothing behind her and very little ahead of her. Annie spent her childhood in and out of the poorhouse, the grim charitable institution that took in those the parish could not otherwise support, and she grew up largely illiterate, unable, by most accounts, to read or write with any real fluency, even into her adult years. There was nothing in her beginnings that should have produced a woman capable of moving through the drawing rooms of the British aristocracy, through the newspaper offices of 2 hemispheres, through the trust of 1,000 desperate families, entirely on the strength of her own invention, and yet those who met her again and again across decades and continents described the same 2 things: striking beauty and an almost frightening charm, a capacity to hold a room, to make herself believed, that had nothing to do with education or birth, and everything to do with a kind of raw, instinctive theatre that she had clearly been honing since she was a girl too poor to own a second dress. I want you to sit with that gap for a moment, the poorhouse child and the woman in the red housecoat receiving a journalist, as though she had been born to it, because that gap is the whole engine of every fraud she ever ran. Annie Gordon Baillie did not inherit privilege. She manufactured it out of nothing but nerve and observation, and she used it as a tool with more precision than most people who are actually born into that world ever learn to wield their own advantages. Picture what the poorhouse actually meant for a girl in her position, because it is not a detail to pass over quickly. A Victorian poorhouse was built on the deliberate principle that relief should be made as unpleasant as possible, so that only the truly desperate would ever apply for it. Families were frequently separated on entry, men from women, children from parents, all housed in strict segregated wards under a regime of hard, repetitive labor designed to feel like punishment for the crime of being poor. A child raised partly inside that system absorbed very early a lesson that would serve her for the rest of her life in exactly the way its designers never intended. She learned precisely what the respectable world looked down upon, precisely which signals marked a person as beneath notice and by simple inversion, precisely which signals she would need to counterfeit in order to be treated as though she were above it. Nobody set out to teach Annie Gordon Baillie the grammar of class performance. The poorhouse taught her by showing her, day after day, exactly what its absence looked like. By her 20s, she had already begun the pattern that would define her entire life. She moved through Scotland and northern England, running up substantial unpaid bills at shops and hotels, presenting herself under a rotating cast of invented aristocratic titles, borrowing against a status she did not hold and had no intention of ever paying for. In 1872, the law caught up with her for the first time, and she was convicted of obtaining goods under false pretenses and sentenced to 9 months. It would not be her last conviction, and it would not be, by any measure, her worst offence. Later in that same decade, she ran a bogus charitable subscription for a Protestant girls' school she claimed was to be built in the heart of Catholic Rome, drawing donations from sympathetic patrons for an institution that existed nowhere but in her own telling of it. She married an opera singer somewhere in these years, had 3 children with him, spent a period living in New York as a family, and eventually returned to Britain alone, the marriage and the American venture both, in their own ways, having run their course. Later still, in the late 1870s, she was caught again, and this time the sentence was severe: 5 years of penal servitude, hard labor behind the actual walls of a Victorian prison, rather than the comparatively gentle 9 months her first offence had earned her. Consider how much practice each of those earlier frauds actually gave her, because none of them were wasted, not even the failures. The unpaid shop bills taught her exactly how far a confident manner and a borrowed title could stretch before a merchant's patience ran out. The Rome charity taught her something even more valuable, that people would open their purses for a cause rather than a person, that a sufficiently sympathetic cloak, a Protestant school for poor girls in a foreign, largely Catholic capital, could loosen wallets that a simple personal appeal never would have reached. The marriage to the opera singer, whatever else it gave her, placed her for a time inside a household of genuine artistic respectability in New York, among people who moved easily between performance and reality in ways an ordinary Aberdeenshire washerwoman's daughter would never otherwise have observed up close. Every version of Annie Gordon Baillie that the record shows us was, in its way, a rehearsal for the one that would eventually walk onto the Isle of Skye. She had spent 3 decades learning exactly how to make herself believed. She served that sentence, however much of it the law required, and she came out the other side of it, and did the one thing her entire life had already proven she would always do. She began again. And this time she was aiming higher than shopkeepers and charity boxes. This time she was aiming at an entire community, in the grip of the worst crisis of its modern history. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. To understand what Annie Gordon Baillie did on Skye, you first have to understand exactly how much desperation she was walking into. Because the Crofters of the Scottish Highlands in the 1880s were not simply poor. They were a population in open, organized revolt against a system that had spent the better part of a century trying to remove them from their own land. The Highlands had been emptied once already, in the notorious clearances of the earlier part of the century, when landlords cleared entire glens of tenant farmers to make way for more profitable sheep, driving families onto marginal coastal strips or onto emigrant ships bound for a new world that owed them nothing. By the 1880s, the Crofters who remained, the small tenant farmers working tiny plots on land that belonged, in law, entirely to their landlords, had reached the end of their patience. Rents were high, Land was scarce and poor. Eviction hung over every family that fell behind, and falling behind was, in a bad year, close to unavoidable. The Highlands rose up. Crofters refused to pay rents they considered unjust. They resisted the sheriff's officers sent to serve eviction notices, in confrontations that in places turned violent, and the government in London was eventually forced to send in the constabulary and, in some districts, the Royal Navy itself, to keep order in what the newspapers of the day called the Crofters' War. 2 years before Gordon Baillie ever set foot on Skye, the resistance had already turned into open confrontation at a place called the Braes, where Crofters faced down a force of police sent from Glasgow to enforce evictions. A clash violent enough to make national headlines and to force the government, for the first time in decades, to take the Highland land question seriously as a matter of state. A royal commission under Lord Napier had travelled the length of the crofting counties taking evidence directly from tenant farmers, an almost unheard-of act of official attention toward people who were accustomed to being governed rather than consulted. By the time Annie arrived, the Crofters of Skye had spent years being interviewed, investigated, occasionally arrested, and endlessly discussed by a distant government, without yet receiving the one thing they actually needed, a resolution. They were a community that had learned, through hard and repeated experience, that official processes moved slowly and that outside attention did not always translate into outside help. And into that particular fatigue, that specific weariness with promises that took years to become anything real, walked a woman offering a solution that required no commission, no inquiry, and no more waiting at all. It was into this landscape, at the tail end of 1884, with the whole of the Highland world watching the government's Napier Commission weigh whether the Crofters' grievances would finally be recognized in law, that Gordon Baillie arrived on the Isle of Skye. I want you to picture the specific vulnerability she was walking into, because it explains everything about why her scheme worked as well as it did, at least for a while. These were people who had spent years fighting, at real physical risk, simply to keep the tiny plots of land they already had. They had watched the government commission take evidence and heard promises made, and were still waiting, month after month, for anything resembling real relief to arrive. Into that waiting, exhausted, half-hopeful community walked a woman who presented herself as an affluent literary figure, an author of standing come to document their suffering, sympathetic, well-connected, and possessed of exactly the kind of outside influence that a community running out of patience with the Crown's own commission might have been desperate to believe in. She did not offer them a fight. She offered them an exit. She told them, and told the newspapers who interviewed her in her borrowed finery, that she could arrange for entire families, whole townships if it came to it, to emigrate to reclaimed marshland near Melbourne, in the colony of Australia, land she described as fertile and ready and simply waiting for hands willing to work it. To men and women who had spent years fighting a war they were not certain they could win, the offer of an entirely different life, on entirely new land, under an entirely different sky, must have sounded like the answer to every prayer the Crofters' War had failed to answer. Around 1,000 tenant farming families are believed to have come forward to take her at her word. Persit with that number for a moment, because it is the true measure of what Gordon Baillie actually did on Skye, and I do not think it has ever been given its proper weight. 1,000 families is not a handful of gullible individuals taken in by a smooth talker. It is close to the scale of a small exodus, a meaningful fraction of an island's entire population, staking whatever they had left, hope, savings, faith in a stranger's word, on the promise of a woman who had walked onto their island a few weeks earlier, owning nothing but a costume and a story. If this account is holding you the way it holds me, I would ask you to share it, because I think this is exactly the kind of fraud that deserves to be remembered on the same scale as the worst violence this channel usually covers, precisely because it was aimed at so many people at once. What she asked of them was whatever they could scrape together, contributions toward the cost of passage, toward the securing of the land itself, money drawn from families who had by definition very little of it to spare. Families who were choosing to hand over what savings existed rather than risk losing everything to another failed harvest or another eviction notice under the old order. She took the subscriptions. She gave interviews to the regional press, cementing her role as the great benefactress of the Highland cause, a wealthy literary woman using her own connections for the Crofters' benefit. And at some point in the unfolding of the scheme, she did travel to Australia herself, or arranged for the matter to be investigated, ostensibly to secure the land she had promised. What was actually waiting there, when anyone finally looked closely enough to see it, was not fertile ground ready for the plough. It was boggy, waterlogged marshland, unfit for the kind of agricultural life she had described to 1,000 hopeful families back on Skye. The land existed. It was real dirt on a real map. It was simply worthless for the purpose she had sold it for, and there is no record that she ever intended, or ever attempted, to turn that swamp into the fertile new start she had promised in her interviews. Think about the particular cruelty embedded in that detail. This was not a lie built entirely of thin air, the kind of fraud where nothing at all exists behind the promise. It was worse than that in its way, because there was a real place, a real patch of colonial earth she could point to and say, "There, that is where you are going." And the Crofters had no means at that distance across an ocean, with no independent way to verify a single word of it, to know that the ground she pointed to would swallow a plough rather than support one. The lie was built to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny a desperate, trusting community was capable of applying to it from 4,000 miles away. No ships ever came for the Crofters of Skye. No families were ever settled on that marshland outside Melbourne, and slowly, as the months passed and the promised passage never materialized, the community that had staked its hope on Gordon Baillie was left holding nothing but the memory of a woman in a red housecoat who had told them, with total conviction, that she was going to save them. Try to imagine the specific texture of that waiting, because it is easy to state the fact of the fraud and skip past the years it actually cost the people living inside it. A crofting family that had committed its savings toward passage would have gone on working the same exhausted plot of land through another planting season, another harvest, another round of rent, all the while believing, perhaps, that the ship was simply delayed, that the paperwork for the Australian land grant was simply slow, that the woman who had seemed so certain, so well connected, so entirely unlike the ordinary officials who came and went from the island, must still be arranging things somewhere out of sight. Doubt, in a scheme like this, rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small increments, a season passing with no word, then two, then a neighbor quietly admitting they had written and received no answer, until the whole township was left holding the same unspoken realization without anyone willing to be the first to say it aloud. Some of those families had likely already told their landlords, their neighbors, perhaps even their own children, that they would soon be leaving for a new life across the world. Watching that future dissolve, not in a single dramatic collapse but in a long, grinding accumulation of silence, may have been its own particular cruelty, distinct from the loss of the money itself. She was not, in the end, caught for what she did to the Crofters of Skye. The law that finally closed in on her in 1888 came for an entirely different set of victims. The London shopkeepers she had continued to defraud even while the Skye scheme was still unraveling behind her, running up bills and debts under yet another rotation of invented names in the capital. Detective Inspector Henry Marshall of Scotland Yard arrested her that year, and the charges that followed concerned the merchant frauds in London rather than the far larger and far crueler betrayal she had orchestrated on Skye. She was sentenced to 5 years. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the legal system of her own era never fully reckoned with the Skye fraud on its own terms, that the woman who took subscriptions from 1,000 families was ultimately punished, at least on paper, for a handful of unpaid shop bills in London. The scale of harm and the scale of legal consequence in this case never came close to matching. Part of the reason lies in exactly who her victims were. A London shopkeeper defrauded of an unpaid bill was a man with standing, with a solicitor within easy reach, with the resources and the social position to make a formal complaint that Scotland Yard would take seriously and act on quickly. A crofting family on Skye, robbed of a far larger sum and a far larger future, was a household at the very bottom of the era's social ladder, geographically remote from the courts that might have heard their case, already treated with suspicion by an establishment that had spent years viewing their political agitation as a public order problem rather than a legitimate grievance. The same social invisibility that had made them vulnerable to Gordon Baillie's promises in the first place made it almost impossible for them to be taken seriously as victims once those promises collapsed. Her crime against the Crofters was, in the strict eyes of the law that eventually caught her, essentially unprosecuted. It survives in the historical record not because the courts of her own day insisted on remembering it, but because the sheer scale of what she attempted was too remarkable for the newspapers and eventually the historians to let it disappear entirely. And her story did not end with that sentence. She served her time, and when she emerged, she did what she had always done. She began again. She was imprisoned once more afterward for art theft, one further conviction in a criminal career that by now spanned decades and continents. Eventually she made her way to America, to New York, the same city where she had once lived respectably as a wife and mother during her marriage to the opera singer years before. There was no respectability waiting for her this time. In 1902, officials committed Gordon Baillie to a New York workhouse, the American equivalent of the very institution that had raised her as a destitute child in Peterhead half a century before. After that commitment, she disappears from the historical record entirely. No death certificate has been traced. No further mention of her survives in any newspaper or court document that historians have yet uncovered. The woman who invented at least 40 identities across her lifetime managed, in the end, to erase herself so completely that even her death has no name attached to it. Consider the shape of that ending, because it is the central irony this whole case turns upon, and it is a harder, colder irony than almost anything a murder case could offer. Gordon Baillie built an entire career on selling other people an escape from poverty she had personally never solved for herself. She took the last hope of 1,000 Crofter families and exchanged it for money to fund a life of costumes and false titles that was never at any point actually secure. And when the frauds finally ran out, when the last court had extracted the last sentence it could, she ended her days exactly where she began them, in the charitable institution built for those society had given up finding any other place for. The workhouse in New York and the poorhouse in Peterhead were, functionally, the same building wearing a different flag. She had spent 50 years and 3 continents trying to outrun the exact fate she finally landed back inside. What does this case reveal about the world that made it possible? It reveals how completely a genuine, desperate political crisis could be turned into raw material for a confidence trick. The Crofters' war was real. The suffering that drove it was real. The government commission investigating it was real. And the eventual legal reforms it produced were real and lasting. Gordon Baillie did not create any of that suffering. She read it correctly as an opportunity, understanding that a population exhausted by years of genuine struggle against a genuine injustice would be primed to believe almost anyone who arrived promising rescue, especially a woman who dressed and spoke like exactly the kind of ally that struggle had been hoping would eventually appear. The very authenticity of the Crofters' cause is what made them so completely vulnerable to a woman selling a counterfeit solution to it. There is a second, quieter observation worth making about how thoroughly the era's own class assumptions did her work for her. Annie Gordon Baillie was believed, again and again, across decades and across continents, not because her stories were flawless, but because Victorian society had trained itself to extend automatic credibility to anyone who could perform the accent, the dress, and the bearing of the aristocracy. A poorhouse child correctly understood that the costume mattered more than the substance behind it, that a red housecoat and a handful of rings could open doors that a lifetime of honest labor, for a woman of her actual birth, never would have. She did not defeat the class system of Victorian Britain. She simply learned, with total precision, exactly which of its performances it was willing to take on trust, and she performed them flawlessly for the whole of her adult life. Here is the question I want to leave with you, and I would genuinely like to read your answer in the comments below. 1,000 Crofter families gave what little they had to a woman who promised them a new life on the other side of the world, and that money simply disappeared into the general churn of her life, into the next town, the next alias, the next scheme. We do not know what happened to a single shilling of it. We do not know how many of those families ever fully recovered from the loss. How many marriages or futures were quietly altered by money that was never coming back? Does it change anything, knowing that the woman responsible ended her own life in a workhouse, penniless and erased? Is that a form of justice finally arriving, however late and however accidental, or is it simply proof that the wreckage she left behind on Skye was never repaid by anything at all, least of all her own eventual ruin? The Isle of Skye is a tourist destination now, its coastline photographed by millions who have never heard the name Annie Gordon Baillie and never heard of the ships that were promised and never came. The crofting townships that fought so hard through the Crofters' War did in the end win real and lasting legal protections, the security of tenure and fair rent that the Napier Commission's findings eventually helped secure in law, a genuine victory bought by genuine suffering. But somewhere inside that larger, hard-won victory sits a smaller and sadder footnote that history has never fully settled. 1,000 families who believed a stranger in a red housecoat and who waited, for how long we do not precisely know, for a ship that had never existed anywhere but in her own telling of it. Her name was Annie Gordon Baillie, born in poverty in Peterhead in February of 1848, raised in a poorhouse, largely unable to read or write, and gifted with a beauty and a nerve that carried her, on the strength of invention alone, into the drawing rooms and newspaper columns of 2 hemispheres. She used at least 40 names across her lifetime, and told the truth, by most accounts, under almost none of them. She promised 1,000 of the poorest families in the Scottish Highlands a new life on fertile land that turned out to be a swamp, and she vanished, in the end, into a New York workhouse, and then into total historical silence, a woman who spent 50 years inventing herself into being and disappeared, at last, without even the dignity of a recorded death. Somewhere in the gap between the Crofters, who are still, in the correspondence and the newspaper record, waiting for a ship, and the woman who never meant to send one, is the exact shape of what a long con actually costs, and who is ever really left to pay for it.